This is a second part on the English Civil War. In the first video we saw the causes, and now we're going to look at the events and the significance of what has happened during and after the war. So civil war has broken out in England in 1642, and we have two sides. The Royalists were called the Cavaliers, whilst the Parliamentarians were called the Roundheads. Parliamentarians were mainly strongest in the south of England, especially London, whilst the king's support came from the north and the west of England. This was not just a political conflict, but often also a personal and a social one. Friends, communities, and even families were divided about which side to support. Some people at the time even referred to the 1640s as a world turned upside down, as everything familiar and stable in society was being challenged. The monarchy, church, class was all turned on its head. At the start of the war, the Roundhead and the Cavalier armies each had around 60 to 70,000 men each, and it wasn't really clear who would come out on top. The other kingdoms also became involved, as the Irish sided with the king, whilst the Scots with Parliament in much greater numbers. But a major turning point in the war was the creation of the new model army by Parliament in 1645. This was a very large and professional army, reaching 22,000 men in its peak. In the new model army, soldiers were well equipped and well paid, they were highly disciplined, and officers were promoted by merit rather than class. This was a game changer, and the new model army met the Royalists at the Battle of Naseby in June 1645 and crushed the royal forces, ending any real hope for Royalist victory. Eventually, Charles was captured by the Scots and handed over to Parliament to be taken as a prisoner, ending the First English Civil War. So Parliament has won by 1646, and there's now a lot of questions about what on earth to do with the country in the next few years. Here, I want to distinguish between conservatives and radicals. Conservatives, not to be confused with a political party, and that's people who wanted to keep the old, traditional system in place. And then on the flip side, you have what are called radical groups, who wanted big changes to the country. And we will see these ideas in later topics as well. Now, a lot of the members of Parliament are still fairly conservative, and they've got rid of the king, but they might fear too much change in the country. And then among the army, you have really radical groups emerging, and we see political radicalism during the Civil War era. For example, you have groups such as the Levellers, who believed in equal rights, religious tolerance, and that all men should be allowed to vote for the politicians of a country, a really revolutionary idea for the 17th century. You also have the Diggers, who split from the Levellers, and they wanted to change the social order by abolishing all private property and forming communities in which everyone works on the land and are equal. Again, this idea that the natural order of everything in England was being challenged. The world turned upside down. Now, some of the army leaders and conservative politicians thought that this radical politics was all getting out of hand. They sat down in a meeting called the Putney Debates in 1647 to settle the disagreements, especially about who could vote and what to do with the king. Two representatives from each army regiment were elected to represent them. Unfortunately, the Putney Debates broke up without reaching a resolution, and rebellions and mutinies followed. This was made worse by the fact that Charles had escaped from captivity in Hampton Court Palace, and a real problem emerged as a second civil war was starting. The second civil war would only last around 6 months, and Scotland had switched sides and attacked Parliament forces. Their army was defeated at the Battle of Preston in 1648, and Charles was recaptured and imprisoned again. Now it was proven that Charles could not be trusted, and they needed to find a solution. The king was put on trial for high treason, and if he was found guilty, it would mean the king would be sentenced to death. Well, the trial was extremely one-sided, and Charles maintained a defiant, but supposedly quite elegant and dignified stance during it, saying what right does Parliament have to put the king on trial? In the end, he was sentenced to execution, with 59 people signing a document that was a death warrant of King Charles I. It was a cold winter's day on the 30th of January 1649, and a huge crowd gathered as the king gave his final speech, defending the monarchy and his divine rights. Two men, heavily disguised in masks to hide their identity, stood ready to perform the act. With the wield of the axe, royal authority came to a dramatic end, sending shockwaves around Europe. With the monarchy abolished, a republic called the Commonwealth of England was created, led by Parliament, and increasingly by one man, Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell had been one of the key leaders of the new model army and also signed a death warrant to the king. Over the years, his image has been quite controversial. On the one hand, people see him as a hero of liberty who removed a tyrannical king. In a BBC television poll in 2002, he was ranked in the top 10 greatest Britons of all time. But then, on the flip side, he was a very strict Protestant called a Puritan, and he imposed Puritan laws in England which made him very unpopular, such as closing theatres, stopped women from wearing makeup, and he even banned Christmas. He also gets a bit of hate because he ended up executing the king just to rule like a king himself. In 1653, Cromwell expelled his parliament and took over as Lord Protector. He was basically a king in all but name, and he crushed the groups calling for greater social equality, such as the Levellers and the Diggers. He was also deeply unpopular in Ireland, because the soldiers he sent there to crush rebels resulted in the loss of around 40% of the population of Ireland. Oliver Cromwell died in 1658, and his position of Lord Protector went to his son Richard Cromwell, which sounds like something a king would do. While Richard's weakness resulted in the collapse of the Republic, and in 1660, Parliament invited Charles II to return home from exile and restore the monarchy after 11 years. This was called the Restoration. If you remember those 59 people who signed the death warrant of his father, well, Charles II stopped at nothing to round up most of them and execute the killers to avenge his father. Even the ones who had already died, such as Cromwell, well, their rotten corpses were dug up and hanged. And that's the end of the story. Now, I've given you a lot of information here, and it's a very dense topic, but let's just take a step back and look at the significance of the English Civil War. First of all, in the short term, royal authority came to a dramatic end in 1649 with the execution of Charles I. Now, this is short term because his son was restored to the throne, but this is the first and only time a monarch in English history has ever been executed, which is so important. You could also say that the country has never been so divided as during the Civil War, as friends and family were fighting against one another. In the long term, we do have the monarchy restored, but things are now different, and the monarch never had the same absolute power. Parliament's authority was now supreme to the king, and the king was subject to the same laws as everybody else. Up to this point, it's about royal authority, but now it is more about who is in Parliament and also who is represented in it, which will be especially important as we go into the 19th century with calls for all men to have the right to vote. That's it for this video, and in the next one we will jump across the ocean and explore the American Revolution. See you then.